Welcome to another Unwinding with Fiber and Fabric and Tour de Fleece 2022. You might see I have a pile of white fiber here. I have my symphony, and over here in the basket hiding are two finished hanks of yarn. So let's just go ahead and dive in, find out what the topic of the day is. And today's topic is wraps per inch. This is an interesting topic. As I was creating the notes for this, I kind of ran into a bit of a question, a bit of a pondering. So let's go ahead and get some. This is a blend between alpaca, silk, and targhee. And I've blended it on the blending board. I'm going to go ahead and get it spinning, and then I'll start talking about the pondering, that the question I ran into with wraps per inch. So wraps per inch is the number of wraps around a gauge, a ruler, in 1 inch of measurement. And it is a way for spinners, to measure, to gauge the thickness of their yarn. And I've been using wraps per inch. My husband's made me a whole bunch of different turned little tools that I can use to wrap my yarn around, to get an understanding of how thick or fine my yarn is. Oh my goodness, this targhee, silk, and alpaca, it is amazing in the fingers. Oh my goodness. When I was blending this, I really thought this might end up being quite a lovely fiber, and it is. It's slipping right through my fingers though. All right, a little more twist. I have not spun this blend before, so you are seeing me first time testing out what this fiber wants to do. Oftentimes, especially before I record, I'll test out a sample of it just to get an idea and to see if the bobbin's going to be noisy, etc. But this time I decided we're just going to wing it and see what we get. But I thought, as I was blending all of this, now at least a month ago, if not more, that it was going to be a lovely fiber, and it is. It's a lovely blend. And this alpaca, as opposed to the alpaca I've been spinning behind the scenes blended with some CVM, this alpaca is ultra fine, ultra nice. The other alpaca is a little coarser, little just a little less fun, a little more prickly. Sidetrack here. So this alpaca is some that I have I think purchased recently because it was really just so pretty. Or I may have purchased it when I was in Colorado. I can't remember. I just remember I did purchase this one, but the other one I'm using is one that somebody gave me. I was at the Estes Park wool market, and I was in the parking lot getting ready. We had just arrived, and we were walking through the parking lot to get to the event, and a woman carrying a big trash bag full of fiber. She said, "Are you a spinner?" And I said, "Yes." And she said, "Here, take this. If I return home with it, my husband is not going to be happy with me." But I knew from knowing people who, were more practice spinner, longtime spinners, people who, were, in essence in the weaving guild that I belonged to at the time. My daughter had joined the weaving guild when she was younger, and I eventually did join it as well. I knew from them, I knew from a number of sources that at that time, alpaca was being bred, at least in the majority of, I think, the United States at that time, they were being bred as show animals, not necessarily bred for fiber for spinning. And there is a difference when when you're not paying attention to the fiber, when the fiber is secondary to what you're breeding for. You don't get what, maybe breed standard or ultra standard, the fine stuff. And so doing these 2 alpaca blends right now and spinning them so close together, I'm definitely seeing what they meant, that that a lot of the alpaca that I sourced in those early years, it's not the top spinning quality. This white that is blended here is. My targi, I should have combed to get a cleaner, more aligned fiber. It would be an even more slippery and lovely spin if I did. But I think I'm going to really be happy with this yarn. Okay, so back to the topic of wraps per inch. So wraps per inch, as I said, is a way we measure our yarn. And, I started measuring my yarn years ago. And I went online and I looked for charts to, to help me understand what that yarn was based on, in comparison to commercial yarn, in comparison to other yarn. Well, one of the big charts that I always come back to is on Ravelry. They have a chart, but the year that I decided I was going to spin lace weight, I was rather perplexed, because there was a huge jump between fingering weight, or even light fingering weight, and lace. I mean, a huge jump, nowhere in between. And I thought, well, that seems kind of odd. Well, as I was doing the research for my notes for this, I started looking into wraps per inch more, and I started looking into the various books that I have on spinning to see what they said about wraps per inch. And lo and behold, one of the things that I discovered is a lot of the older books don't even mention wraps per inch. They do mention how to weigh and measure your fiber on using to determine the grist, which I believe, I could be completely wrong, but from what I was reading, I believe that, and from what I remember somebody trying to show us how to do when my daughter first started weaving, that is a good way of understanding the yarn in order to calculate how much you're going to need for a weaving project. Okay. But I think yards per pound or something like that is what they're they were always calculating. But either way, in the older books, there is little to no reference at all to the term wraps per inch. So I thought, well, okay, that's really interesting. And across the board, whether the book was being published in the United States, in Australia, in the UK, it seemed I couldn't find wraps per inch. What I did find, and this is part of the reason I went down I went down a further rabbit hole of searching, is a more modern chart that does somewhat align with what I now see on a lot of the wraps per inch gauges you can purchase, the ones that are etched into wood or plastic. that we can use, that we can keep at our spinning wheel to help us keep a consistent spin. What I did find is a little bit better chart that matches all of that, and it's in this book, Yarnitecture. I think I'm saying that right, by Jillian Moreno. Let me bring that up. There we go. Okay. And I was quite taken with this, because in this one, it categorizes lace as anything less than 25, or I should say anything greater than 25 wraps per inch. Now, what I've seen in others is that for it to be lace weight, it needs to be 30 wraps per inch or greater. But it says that fingering weight is 20 to 25 wraps per inch. Sport weight is 17 to 20 wraps per inch. DK weight is 13 to 16 wraps per inch. And worsted weight is 9 to 12 wraps per inch, with bulky being 6 to 8 wraps per inch. And so the chart was different, clearly different than what I was using on Ravelry, but it helped answer another question that had come up because I had some commercial yarn that I had been looking at. So, story of this commercial yarn. Years ago, I purchased some sock yarn, some fingering weight sock yarn from a company, reputable company, and I purchased it to do some dyeing with it, and basically dyed up a number of skeins of fingering weight yarn. I haven't used all of it up, so some of it is sitting in my stash, and this was more than 10 years ago. Okay, so just recently I was given some fiber that is listed as fingering weight and some that is listed as sport weight. And these fibers, these hanks of yarn, both of which have been dyed by indie dyers using very similar wool blends as to what I used all those years ago. Only when I'm comparing the fingering and sport weight, what I'm discovering is that the fingering weight is extremely fine compared to even probably finer than what I used to consider extra fine, or, you know, fine fiber, extra fine fingering weight or fine fingering weight. So it's extremely fine. And the sport weight, when I was looking at it, or I shouldn't say sport weight, it was listed as DK weight. The DK weight was listed, it was the exact same fiber as what I spun all those years ago. So I was like, wait a minute, have we changed the way we categorize yarn, at least here in the United States? And I think that is the key. So I know that growing up, sport weight yarn was a terminology that was used, and worsted weight yarn was a terminology that we used. But I hadn't really run into DK weight until I started spinning, and I started, you know, hearing about more fibers coming in from other parts of the world. So what I've been able to surmise from looking at these hanks of yarn, from looking at these different charts, that some that have not obviously been updated, I know that from my reading years ago, that there wasn't a direct equivalency between commercial yarn grades and anything that we had in the spinning world. I also know that back in the day, there wasn't a lot of consistency between yarns sold here in the United States versus in the UK versus Australia versus Latin America. I know that that was the case. So what it appears to be happening is that some of our industry is deciding to try to universalize the language just a little bit more. And this book, just, you know, it's published in 2016. So it's compared to the yarn in my stash, it's relatively recent. Oh my goodness. It's so strange to think that 2016 is still that many years away, or that, you know, in the past. But the chart that is in here, I thought it kind of makes more sense, and it does match a lot more with all the gauges that you can now buy. I do believe that when it comes to lace, there's more categories that, you know, tend to be not listed here. I know that I have some spinning gauges that have more categories, but I also know I bought a pack of spinning gauges, and there are 2 cards and they don't match each other. Actually, there's 3 cards in the set, and all 3 cards have different slightly different information on them. So what does that mean for us? Well, first of all, I think it is wonderful that we are reaching a point where we're trying to get a little more standardized in our language between areas of the world, or at least English-speaking areas of the world. I can't necessarily verify for everywhere else, but something tells me that it's because we are now shipping yarn to more places. More indie dyers are doing international sales. So I think that's wonderful. Having a more consistent, more universal language really helps. Because when you're trying to knit a sweater, knit from your hand spun, it does help if you can kind of have an idea how your yarn is going to work in the pattern. Yes, with hand spun, unless the pattern is a very basic recipe for a top-down item that you can try on, much like the shawls that I have on my blog for free in PDF form for anybody who wants to give them a try. Unless they're really a simple top-down construction, you really do have to have a gauge. You need to have a gauge swatch. You need to identify how your specific hand-spun yarn is going to work in your project. That gauge is all the more vital when you're working with your hand-spun, because while the wraps per inch may give you an idea, it's not going to be an exact thing, mainly because no 2 people are going to wrap around the gauge, the ruler, in the same way. There's a great picture. I'll share there's a great picture in here, and I'll share a picture of this. And I do recommend this book if you're, you know, if it's a very useful book, photos, the whole works. But they show a picture right there, okay? And what they're trying to explain with that picture is that even the same person, if they wrap tighter or looser, depending on the day, is going to have a slightly different gauge to their wraps per inch, different measurement. Different sections of your spun yarn, even though they may be very similar to the eye, may actually not measure on the ruler exactly the same. So if you are making something that really requires fitted measurements and instructions, I highly recommend you do a swatch. That's one of the reasons I like simple top-down raglan, top-down yoke construction, is because they're oftentimes it's just a recipe and you use measurements, much like they used to do back in old patterns. You use a recipe that tells you measurements of how many inches you are going to need. And those inches are really based, and it can be very much based on your own body. But I knit in a relaxed manner. I tend to like seamless top-down construction. I've done a couple top or bottom-up construction. When it comes to sweaters, I'm a top-down girl. When it comes to socks, I'm a bottom-up, because then again, you separate your fiber into two balls. You start at the toe and you go toe up, and you stop your socks when you run out of fiber. So, speaking of running out, I think, oh yeah, I just wanted to mention that in addition to the inconsistent thickness and thinness that we can have, even in a very consistent looking yarn, oftentimes when we are spinning hand spun, our spinning is denser. We don't have the same ability that a machine does. We're not using the same prep as the machines often do. We're not going to make as fluffy of a yarn. Now, that's not to say we can't make fluffy yarn, but as a rule, our hand spun tends to be a little denser than the machine equivalent. And because of that, it's going to shift how that yarn wraps around the gauge, because a soft, squishy woolen yarn is going to compress as it wraps around the dowel or the gauge, the ruler, whereas a worsted or more densely spun fiber won't compress as much as you wrap it. So I wanted to mention that as well. That's one of the other things with it. Now, speaking of dense versus woolen, I will first of all share my extra spin that's been going on in the background. This is CVM and alpaca, all natural color. The alpaca was very rustic in tone, and the CVM was a soft fawn type or taupey light brown sandy color. And it turned out really well. I was very pleased. Even before setting the twist, it was very balanced. It is 336 yards. That is 5.4 ounces or 354 grams. And it comes out to be 14 wraps per inch, which let's open up the book. 14 wraps per inch, according to this chart, puts us in the DK category. And that is actually very much what I was aiming for. I have a tendency to wrap, when it's CVM, I have a tendency to hit 14 wraps per inch. It's just one of those things. My hands, even with the alpaca added to this one, my comfort zone is 14 wraps per inch. So it turned out quite lovely. I'm pleased with it. But the fiber you've been seeing me spin these last couple days, my green. Now remember, my goal was to spin this 4 ounces of merino fluffier than it normally wants to spin. And I pulled off 12 wraps per inch, which, according to the chart, look at this again, according to the chart, I have just barely, just squeaked in to the worsted weight yarn I was aiming for. It is only a 2-ply, and I managed to spin a fluffier, softer yarn. So this was a challenge because, as I said, I always seem to get 14 wraps per inch. That's just my comfort zone. But I really thought about it. I took my time, even though I was recording, and I managed to get my goal. And there are some softer areas and some more firm areas because it's going to happen, especially when you're distracted. And I don't worry about it. I'll show you this section right here. You can see, especially because it has a little bit of a barber pole, there's some slightly fluffier sections. There are some less fluffier sections. But overall, I've hit the goal of a worsted weight yarn that is soft and airy and fluffy. It produced me 214 yards. It is a 4-ounce hank. It is 100% merino, hand dyed by me and mostly spun in front of you. So I wanted to bring that to you. I wanted to share it with you. I wanted to share the caution of the wraps per inch. It is to be used by us. Just know that it is, as I was reading in one article, when you are, if you're planning to sell your yarn, which I don't, weight is going to be a more accurate way to advertise it. With that being said, just a little strange caveat that I happen to know from experience. Yarn absorbs the moisture or dryness around you. So a yarn that is 4 ounces in a humid area may not be 4 ounces when it reaches a dry area. Just something to keep in mind, that the wool does absorb some of the moisture around it, just like our skin and our own hair does. And when you get to an extremely dry climate, it will have lost that moisture and it might be a different weight. But if you're spinning for yourself, if you are making yarn for your own use, the wraps per inch gauge is going to really be something to help you get a more consistent spin. So I highly recommend you get one of the charts, get one of the gauges for your own use. All right, so I hope that you are having a wonderful tour de fleece and that you're taking time to unwrap with fiber and fabric. And I will see you again tomorrow.